Hello listeners and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you the most topical energy matters in an informal setting. My name is Richard Sverrisson. I'm joined today by my colleague Nora Buli, who is Montel's editor Germany, and our guest today is Aamodt from Statkraft. A warm welcome to you, Gry.
Thank you.
You're the author of a recent report, are you not, about more the global energy systems and the future. It's a view or a vision of what's going to happen up to 2050 into a net zero carbon world. Could you tell us a little bit more about the background to this report and why Statkraft, a power company, has written a report about the total global energy system?
Statkraft has for many years been really deep on power market analysis on a quite long horizon, 20-30 years. But what we see in the last years is that to an increasing degree, the whole energy complex is important for the development within the power sector. So what happens within buildings, industry and transportation is crucial for the development within the power sector. So the last years we spent much more effort into understanding the whole complex. And a part of that work is then this low emission report.
So it's kind of a holistic approach, taking everything into consideration.
Yes.
Absolutely. So what are the main characteristics, or if I were to ask you to summarize the main findings of your report?
First of all, a most important driver is technology. We say that we are optimistic when it comes to technology development, but still realistic as this shall add value to our insights. And then we see how the world pans out. So we don't say that this needs to end in a 2-degree world or this needs to end in a zero-emission world. We just say we see the huge trends that we've seen within technology cost development the last years, and we see what happens if we actually let that continue going forward. And then we end up in a world that has emissions that are consistent with a 2-degree pathway.
There's been a few months since you released the report. Have you made any changes or have you updated any parts of it?
No, we haven't. When we analyze up until 2050, the changes today needs to be really, really big to have a huge impact.
Exactly, yeah.
So we haven't done that, and this is usually a yearly exercise. But of course, if there were huge incidents that we thought we should take into account, we would do that.
I mean, part of it is in the sort of current environment on the sort of policy side, and also from the grassroots development. There's a big, you have the Extinction Rebellion, you have Greta Thunberg, you have, there is a lot more attention on the climate crisis. Do you think the pressure is building on politicians to create the kind of framework that you're talking about in your report?
Yes, that's, I think, also an important driver, what we see in the public opinion these days. And that is important for many reasons. One reason is what you say, that it puts pressure on politicians to actually take actions, and it enables them to take decisions that hasn't been very popular. But the power in the public opinion also is forceful when it comes to people requesting climate-friendly solutions, climate-friendly products that are produced based on sustainable energy, and also changing behavior when it comes to transportation and so on. So of course the public opinion and the momentum we see there is extremely important for how this can develop going forward and how fast the development can be.
What struck me in the report was also you talked a little bit about the tendency in the world for more conflict, and that there's a lack of cooperation on the climate issues here. Do you think this will last, or do you think some of these there are often some very strong characters out there in the world, and do you think that this will be exacerbated in the years to come?
Currently, we don't see any big changes coming up, so it doesn't look that good currently. However, when we model this until 2050, we need to believe in something on that horizon, and that's not given that that's the same as we see today. So there's a huge uncertainty when it comes to this, and this is extremely important for how the world will develop.
You mentioned that, that China, the US and India are the world's biggest emitters, and now we've talked about the sort of grassroots pressure that we're seeing. is that working in those countries as well? Do you see that they are making an effort as well to bring down emissions, or is this more of a European phenomenon?
It's more of a European phenomenon, although we see these tendencies also there. What is good currently is that the costs of renewables are now so low that in most places in the world, actually, it's cheaper to install new renewable capacity than it is to install new thermal capacity. And eventually, actually, in not too long, it will be cheaper to install new renewable capacity than to run existing gas and power plants, depending on where you are. So that is also an important driver, and maybe more important drivers in these areas, at least now.
So that's kind of on the technology side. So
Yes.
that's certainly with wind and solar. Yeah.
So we expect this development regardless of kind of the other drivers, regardless of political driver and public opinion, although those are also important in these countries.
I guess the US are a good example where we have seen coal pushed out despite efforts otherwise to maybe keep the industry going, where I think the technology costs for renewables have played quite a big part as well.
Absolutely.
And gas.
And you see insurers pulling out of fossil fuels, and that's
Exactly.
so that's something that's maybe going to gather momentum
So
as
the
well.
capital market will also be important when it comes to this development. I think 1/4 of investments in US last year, professionally managed assets, they were invested according to sustainability.
Absolutely. I think, shareholders and the public in general will add more pressure onto these investment funds, etc., to pull out of these thermal fossil fuel type of funds.
So there are important drivers that is driving this in the right direction. The question is just how forceful are they and how quick will the change be?
Speaking of quick, I mean, we've mentioned, or you said that the sort of developments you're seeing would take us to the 2-degree scenario, but you also looked at a 1.5 degree scenario, and you said most of the measures or assumptions aren't really different. The big difference is speed.
Yes.
And I guess, again, technological advancement.
Yes.
With what we've just discussed, do you think there's a quite big or good chance that it would sort of accelerate by itself, or do governments have to push for that extra speed?
There are two main challenges actually to get into the 1.5 degree world. One is that it's a big change. It is a big change, and that takes time. You have to install a lot of renewables across the world. And also the electrification we're talking about, that will take a lot of time. For instance, 100 million personal cars needs to be changed from conventional cars to electric vehicles. And that is a big challenge. What is good is that we see that it's much cheaper to try to reach the 1.5 degree target than it is not to. Because you have to cope with climate change, which is extremely expensive and kind of under-communicated when we're talking about the cost of actually going there. But in order for this to happen, and that's kind of a final big challenge, is of course political challenge in this big change, because there will be costs and there will be benefits, and how to actually distribute that across in a way that seems fair to people, between nations, within a country, between individuals. That's the big challenge, and that will determine how fast we can get to the zero emission world.
I mean, I think the global energy trends are fascinating, but often our focus is more on Europe, what happens here. And obviously, I mean, Statkraft is a global player, of course. Statkraft was one of the companies that yesterday urged a greater tightening of the 2030 targets, especially when it comes to decarbonisation, so calling for a 55% reduction rather than 40 compared to 1990 levels. Do you expect this to happen by 2030? I know your companies, obviously they're mostly renewable companies that are calling for this, but do you think that this is likely? Do you expect the new commission to come in and maybe make some key changes?
What we see is that in order for Europe to cost optimally reach their 2050 zero or carbon neutrality target, it would be needed to tighten the 2030 target. So it makes sense to do it, but of course it's politically challenging.
So Statkraft mentioned the 55%, or raising the ambition to 55% reduction. Are there any other factors that could come into play here, do you think?
In general, it's a question of what kind of tool you use to reduce emissions. So, of course, subsidies, direct subsidies, would kind of change the premises for the carbon price. But I don't have a view on the exact.
Okay, no, sure, that's fine. No, I mean, I think it's all a matter of discussion, of course, at the moment as well. But some people have talked about, the linear reduction factor being increased, and perhaps border carbon taxes, so that you have a more of a global level playing field. But of course, these are only discussion points at the moment.
Yeah, but an important point is that in general, it's cheaper to start early to do things rather than doing things right before 2050.
Yeah, exactly. And then it might be too late anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. A key part here is connecting not just the energy or the power sector, but also the heating and the transport. So if you are to meet this 1.5 degree target or 2 degree target, do you think this is realistic across the board? I mean, it's in some countries it's easier to do in others. I mean, have you got any views on this? If we keep in mind what's happening in Europe,
in general, we see due to the falling technology costs that we have cheap energy available in the power sector. The last decade, the wind costs have fallen by 50%, solar fallen by 80%. So this is a huge change. And then in order to decarbonize transportation, buildings and industry, you can utilize that cheap energy also in these sectors. Of course, we have the challenges that we discussed previously, that we need to get there from a political point of view, and that will be more difficult in some areas than in others. But in general, if you are to decarbonize, you should definitely choose electrification for the processes where you can actually electrify, because that's a very low-hanging fruit. And you have some other low-hanging fruits, such as energy efficiency, and you have more expensive solutions. Nuclear, CCS, and so on.
What this do to power demand if we electrify everything? I mean, obviously, we're now looking at a scenario where we want mostly wind and solar and other renewable sources to provide the power. At the same time, more and more power might be required.
Yes.
How do you square that?
No, we say that solar and wind will cover that demand, and we will need to build much more. In Europe, we increase the demand by 60% from today until 2050, which is a lot. And then we also need to replace the existing fossil stack in the power sector with wind and solar mostly. So it's a big change.
What makes you so confident that we will get to that renewables growth? Because taking the example of Germany at the moment, the country is planning to exit coal and is pushing that agenda more or less successfully. But they've also seen almost a stop in growth in onshore wind power. And that's both from a political side, but also from grassroots opposition. So we have on the one side climate protesters saying we want more, we want faster, but on a very local level, when it comes to building the infrastructure necessary, you've got opposition. Do you think that might dissolve, or how can you overcome that?
The opposition will, of course, change from now until 2050, but it might also get stronger. So it's not given in what direction you will see that. In the northern part of Europe, we're lucky to have quite cheap offshore wind available, at least in some years. So that might be a solution. And of course, solar, installing solar is not as controversial as wind. So that might be a solution to that. We expect a lot more solar, but also more wind.
Okay.
And what's Statkraft's position here on offshore wind? This is onshore.
I think it's quite balanced. We expect a lot of offshore wind coming online, especially then in the northern parts of Europe, where it's starting to get cost competitive compared to onshore wind. And we expect less in areas where it's more expensive and where there's plenty of space onshore, like other parts of the world.
What are the implications on this for the energy system as a whole? So if you have a primarily zero carbon generation stack, how do you balance that when it's not sunny, when it's dark, when it's cold and there's no wind? I mean, what happens then?
Here we're actually quite lucky in Statkraft because we actually have the detailed power models, so we can actually check out what happens.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that challenge is much smaller than what people tend to think. So you can live with like 80-90% almost intermittent renewables and still kind of have a system that's quite good fitted together.
That's quite stable,
Yes.
even and the lights won't go out.
Surprisingly stable, but then you need 10-15% fossil.
Okay.
So in zero emission world, first of all, we expect the demand, this new demand from industry, buildings and transportation to be more flexible than the current power demand. But we also see that we will have need for some backup capacity that's zero emission. Could be hydrogen, for instance, zero emission gas, hydrogen from renewables.
From renewables. I mean, you also touch on ammonia here. What role does that play in the storage of power?
Ammonia is in our view, or is an energy carrier, or could be used as an energy carrier at least. In my head, it's hydrogen, just in another form.
Okay.
So you produce hydrogen and you do something with the hydrogen and you still have a lot of energy content. And you can use that in a fuel cell in order to get energy out instead of using hydrogen in the fuel cell. And ammonia has other characteristics than hydrogen, so it can be easier to carry, for instance.
And not so dangerous, maybe. Or,
yes.
Yeah. And that hydrogen, ammonia, they form part of the 10-15% of the sort of backup.
Could do.
Yeah.
Or you could have biomass with CCS, or you could have biomass without CCS. Other solutions, but they are in general quite expensive.
So that's the cost factor. And I just wondered, obviously Statkraft is a major trader of power in the European markets. How will this zero carbon world or net zero carbon world, how will it affect the buying and selling of electricity? Have you done any sort of modelling of this? Currently, you have exchanges, you have brokers, you have companies, you have grid lines. What's your view here?
No, if anything, I would say that we will have increased need for at least trading between countries, because interconnectors and grid will be extremely important. That's also, of course, an extremely important answer of the intermittency challenge. We build a lot of grid in our models because that's low cost compared to the alternatives.
Although it's not cheap either.
It's not cheap either. No. That's true. I didn't say that. But I think there will be absolutely a continued need for marketplaces, and there will be a need for both customers and producers to lay off their risks.
So they could go small scale, maybe more onto distribution level, as well as have the larger
could be
power movements.
Yeah. And it will be more complex because you have other players in the market than what you have had up until now.
With hydrogen sort of taking over, what will be the role of gas? I think your report touched a little bit on that, important in the beginning and then it sort of falls off. But how quickly will that happen? Now there's even talk of maybe not financing any fossil fuels, including gas, from a sort of European Investment Bank side. What does that do to the industry? In
the end game in 2050, there's hardly any room for gas or emissions. And then you don't have room for gas with emissions. So that's as simple as that. But how fast that transition will happen and what you do the first 10, 15 years, that's a difficult question, because it's of course better to burn gas to get power than it is to burn coal from an emission point of view. So it depends on what options you are actually left with when you're closing down nuclear plants in Germany. So we see that you will need gas for a while still. Is the price of CO2 a factor that can help that development? The report again sort of assumes that in the low emission scenario, I think the price of CO2 will be was 120 to 180. No, that was actually in the 1.5. So it's 50 to 60.
Okay, so.
Yeah.
So is that a gradual rise to then a maximum of that by 2050?
Yeah.
Not an average out. So no. Oh, okay.
But why would prices continue to rise to higher levels when less and less demand is generated as you exit the emission or strongly emitting technologies?
That's because we include also the industry and buildings and transportation sector and have a holistic view on this. So it's kind of given some assumptions to begin with there. But then we kind of utilize, or we see, of course, that the CO2 price is a very cost-efficient measure to get to solutions that are the cheapest, also within buildings, industry and transportation.
So obviously some industry as well, it's very hard for them to lower some of their emissions. I mean, and the cement and some of the chemicals industry is very hard. So there'll always be that part maybe there, and that will have to be, they'll have to cover those costs with a high carbon price or cover those emissions with it, Do you expect new nuclear plants to come into the picture here? In the coming 30 years?
Yes, exactly. That's the answer to that question. It takes too long. It can't solve the climate crisis now, at least, because it takes, the projects in UK, it takes far too long time.
Or Finland and France, they're the ones there that are just miles behind schedule and over cost runs.
And also, it's also costly. It's huge projects and it's costly. So we don't see that as a kind of market-based solution, but there might be a political solution in some areas.
How about floating wind or solar? I mean, what do you... That's obviously, I see you have a floating solar plant already in Albania, don't you? And I think Axpo is developing one in reservoirs in Switzerland as well.
They don't float, but they've put them on the walls of the reservoir.
Okay, they're not...
But still, it's new areas where you could fit large-scale solar.
Yeah, and I think it's related to your question on where do you actually build these renewables, because the costs currently are very high for these technologies. And the way of getting costs down is to deploy a lot of them. So that will be the crucial question here. How fast will a lot or a high volume of these technologies be deployed? And currently, as long as there's enough space on land or for conventional bottom fixed, this will not happen to a great degree, but it can happen if there's need for it from a space point of view. So it will probably come, but the question is how fast, when is it needed, and how fast can the cost reduction happen?
And who's going to upfront those costs? For projects that initially aren't very sort of economical.
Like Germany did for solar at the beginning of this decade.
Someone needs to get the ball rolling here. Fascinating discussion and a look into how the energy system would look like in the future. I think the COP moved from Chile to Madrid. What are your expectations here? Are we likely to see any big announcements or any major breakthroughs here?
Of course, I hope to see that. We of course see that in order to reach the climate targets, the NDCs needs to be tightened compared to what we see today. So we're hoping for it. It's, of course, as I said, the whole development is depending on people feeling that this shift or this change is fair. And in order for it to be fair, it needs to be perceived as fair also between countries. So it's extremely important that most countries in the world takes part and commit to what they have pledged in the Paris Agreement.
That's about all we have time for today. So once again, thank you very much, Gry, for joining us, and to you, Nora. Keep up to date with all our stories on Montel News, and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Goodbye.